I understand that it is a cliché thing to say that throughout time, people have always been expected to fulfill certain roles or duties that others lay out for them, and these roles and or duties are often quite strenuous or tumultuous or any sort of laborious nature under the sun. Which is why, consequently, we see in storytelling this trope where we might have someone who is born and either with a silver spoon in their mouth or they're from some sort of lesser circumstance in life, and they're brought up by some dowager or some stroke of luck into this certain position that they are expected to fill by those around them. And there's a bit of conflict as to whether or not this person actually wants to end up in that position that everybody expects them to be in, given this perceived gift that society has just placed in their lap. For this video, we're going to focus on the former, where you have an individual who's being raised in lesser circumstances, get brought up by some sort of dowager or stroke of luck, for lack of better words, and we're going to take a look at how they decide to handle with these expectations that the world expects them to fulfill. More specifically, we're going to be focusing on two works: Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, and then, of course, Beastars by Haru Itagaki. For the sake of brevity, I'm just going to give you a simple overview of how these particular expectations were laid out for both of these characters, Pip from Great Expectations more specifically, and Louis from Beastars, and what these characters did in order to achieve them, and what particular conflicts they felt or encountered along the way before ending up in their final positions. Now let's start with Great Expectations first. Now with Great Expectations, this book follows the story of a young lad named Pip. Pip lives in the English countryside somewhere in Kent in the 1800s, approximately. Basically when England was beginning to really get into the industrial era. Now, initially he lives with his sister and her husband, and they don't exactly click great, but one day Pip is out literally visiting his parents' graves when he encounters this prisoner who demands that he go and get a few things for him. Now, Pip does do these things, and moreover brings this prisoner a piece of a meat pie that his sister had recently cooked for dinner that day. The police end up finding the prisoner and they arrest him. Soon afterward, I don't remember if it's a flash forward a few years or really close, but one day his uncle takes him to this very wealthy lady named Mrs. Havisham, who wants to basically train a young man to be a suitable husband for her daughter named Estella. Now, Mrs. Havisham is just a complete and total train wreck, but I'll get into that, or you can look into why later. But besides the point, what ends up happening is that Pip ends up going to Mrs. Havisham pretty frequently to get trained to be this good young suitor, and then eventually Pip is apprenticed off to his brother-in-law. He's just kind of traded through a bunch of people, and then after his sister gets attacked by some other guy and she's basically left disabled, a lawyer strolls into town named Jaggers, who announces that, "Oh, Pip, you have a benefactor. You're gonna go to school to be a lawyer or do business up in London." So he gets shipped off to London, and he befriends a guy named Herbert, and they become law clerks. But throughout this attempt to become a gentleman, they run up a lot of debts. The guy that attacked his sister kind of shows up too, and then after his sister dies, that convict that he met when he was a kid just kind of shows up, and says, "Oh, you thought Miss Havisham was your benefactor to try and groom you to be a good young lad, right? Nope. I've been sending you money from the penal colony in Australia, meaning that Magwitch was the benefactor, not some other uppity rich person like Miss Havisham, like he had expected. And then after that, Magwitch explains that the reason why he sent Pip all of this money and why he was such a benefactor to Pip was because he remembered that little bit of kindness that Pip showed him when he gave him the meat pie as a child. You know, one act really went a long way. Either of them ironically not expecting such a small act to go such a long way. Now, besides the point, Magwitch is not supposed to be in London because guess what? He's a convict. So Pip tries to help him get out of London. It doesn't succeed. Magwitch gets into a fight with Orlick, and I think Orlick dies, and then Magwitch gets caught, and then he's hung, and then Pip gets sent to debtor's prison because he's in debt, and he also tried to help a guy escape from prison, or rather escape England, which doesn't really help his case at all. Oh, and Pip is basically sick, so he's kind of allowed to just stay at home for a while. But then Mrs. Havisham and the Estella thing just didn't work out. The anticipated romance with Estella didn't really fall through, and instead Pip decides to marry somebody he actually likes, in Biddy. And then after he recovers, he goes abroad and works with Herbert in mercantile trade, and basically returns a long time later to find that Estella has kind of taken Miss Havisham's place back in England, and Pip is, doing well for himself, despite ramping up an immense amount of debt, and then escaping an arranged marriage, and then also getting into immense legal trouble. Typical college-age shenanigans. Now, on to Beastars. Now, Louis, unlike Pip, who had the misfortune of being raised in industrial-era England, was quite literally born and then dropped off at an illegal underground meat processing facility to be used as a product. He was not taught how to read, he was not taught how to write or to even speak until a very relatively later age. And he only got out of that situation because a rich businessman by the name of Oguma decided to drop on by and say, "I want a son. Let me take that one." And paid in full amount in cash just for some random kid to raise as a son and to be an heir to his business. Now we don't really get to see much of anything in between his infancy to when he was a high schooler, but when he's a high schooler, we can assume he's really been tit for tat on following his father's instructions for what he's expected to do. He's the leader of a drama club. He seems to be academically prestigious, and moreover, he's also being selected to be the quote-unquote Beastar by the city council, I presume, to represent everybody as a model citizen. Now, before any of that can happen, Tem gets killed, and then he gets whipped off in some sort of crazy conflict swirling around Haru being kidnapped, and his relationship with her is kind of weird because they like each other, but they're not really committed. No one ever really is in this book series, and it's kind of goofy, but besides the point, eventually he gets fed up with his own inaction and decides to go and try and rescue Haru well after the fact that Lugosi has decided to go do it himself, and after Lugosi succeeds in doing so. But moreover, it's also a bit of a revenge twist because he kind of wants to get revenge on the people who bought him in the first place to be sold as a product on an underground illegal meat trade that slaughters children and whatnot. So he goes in, kills the boss of this basically Yakuza, and assumes the position of the boss, which is a really wild turn of events, especially for someone who's high school age. Now, this requires him obviously to break off with his previous life as the drama club president, per se, I don't know the right word, and high school life and everything. Basically, it requires him to drop out of school and engage in nefarious underground activity, and he does that for a good while, disconnected from his father and his business and everything, until Lugosi kind of wraps him back into the investigation with Tem, and they find whoever the heck killed Tem, and then there's this really crazy chaotic fight where Lugosi literally has to eat Louis' foot in order to whip him up in enough of a rage to subdue Tem's killer, who is a whole bear, because we're dealing with anthropomorphic animals here. And then he gets a prosthetic leg, and then he's kind of teetering in between these relations with his former Yakuza group, the Shishigumi, and his father's business. And there's this strain, there's this tug, because he's also being set up to marry somebody who he doesn't really like, but he feels obligated he needs to foster a relationship with, because it's what he's expected to do, and we're in Japan, and a lot of people, let's face it, in the Japanese work culture don't do things they really want to do, but they do things that they have to do. So consequently, he ends up kind of using his role as a businessman to help Lugosi subdue Melon, and then he just, after Aguma dies, he just accepts the fact that this is going to be his role, despite the things he actually realizes about himself and the people he does like, and the life he might prefer to lead. We can now kind of juxtapose these two characters and find similarities between the two. The first of which is obviously their poor upbringings. Neither of them are very bright, and I don't mean like in an academic sense, obviously I mean in like a prospects kind of way. If you're a kid living in industrial England, future typically is not good for you. You're probably going to work at some sort of textile manufacturing plant and then lose a couple of fingers before you're a teenager, because you have to go reach in those machines to get everything untangled, and then oops, you just lost a finger. And then obviously with Louis, it's not exactly great either, and that's an extreme understatement, obviously, because he was literally going to be killed and then sold as somebody's steak. Now, in the case of Louis, the Dowager was much more evident and active in his life than was in Pip's. From the get-go, we know that Oguma was Louis' benefactor, for lack of better words, because he plucked Louis out from the meat processing center, basically, and raised him as his own son. In the case of Pip, he has his parents, but they're both dead, so he's being raised by his sister, who doesn't rub well with anybody, and her husband. And then it kind of comes up the same thing again with Miss Havisham, and then Jaggard, who's seeing them through their education, and then Herbert is really more of a friend, obviously, but really the only father figure that Pip has to rely on in all of this was Joe, who rears him into being this better person, more so than anybody else, through his apprenticeship, in my opinion. It isn't until later that Pip understands how his actions are kind of not good, not just from the fact of, oh, wasting money is bad kind of perspective, but, oh, I'm wasting this person's money who's working for it, when he realizes that Magwitch has been his benefactor this entire time. So there's that going for you, you know? So when he realizes that Magwitch has been the one providing for him all of these years, he does, you have a change of heart. When looking at how Pip and Louis kind of rebel against the expectations that are laid out in front of them, we find two different ways of kind of combating that. The first one is just through waste. Pip wastes a lot of his money on a lavish lifestyle at school because he has poor influences around him. He's being reared to be this gentleman, but in reality he's just becoming this horrible person, and it takes Magwitch re-entering his life for him to understand that, oh my gosh, I'm kind of a crummy human being. So it might not have been volitional rebellion necessarily, but it was kind of showing that he wasn't really meant for this kind of role if the people around him are failing to mold him into that model citizen that they want him to be. In the case of Louis, he just straight up leaves. He does his own thing for a while. He does the opposite of being a CEO and is instead an organized crime boss, which you could still argue is a CEO, but besides the point, he doesn't waste his opportunities. He inserts himself in a new door he opens for himself, and then tries to fulfill it only to find out that he just isn't suited for that environment, and then returns home. Not because it's necessarily more comfortable, but it's what one he is used to, and secondly, it's kind of easier to fall into those societal obligations, and that's when we can kind of juxtapose where they end up. Pip ends up leading an independent life. Louis, conversely, doesn't. He doesn't marry the person he wants to. He ends up with the person that his father set him up to marry, not with the person like Juno he wants to. Pip does. Pip marries a person he actually loves, instead of Estella, who never really reciprocated those previous affections. So, although they're both able to make a living for themselves and use the skills that they've acquired along their journey to get to the point where they're at, you could make the argument that Pip is a much more independent and probably a happier person at the end of the day than Louis is, because Louis finds himself in the position that was laid out for him despite everything, whereas Pip kind of tweaked it a little bit more. He works in mercantilism and textiles instead of being this law guru. But what does this teach us about societal expectations? Well, first, it kind of shows that in rigid societies like in England or in Japan, you're going to inevitably fall underneath some sort of societal participation. You can try and reject it as much as you want. You can try and go out of your way and escape it, be it through rampant alcoholism or straight up breaking the law that the society has set forth, or a combination of both. But eventually the greater society kind of bends your individuation just enough to wrap you back in one way or another, or you die trying to break off from it, like in the case of Magwitch, or in the case of Louis kind of having to really just come back and do what his father wanted him to do instead of what he wanted to do. So I think ultimately these two stories teach us how we as people need to balance or find a happy medium with society and pure individualized preferences, because if we abandon one, we either become recluses, and that's perfectly fine, or secondly, we totally assimilate and we become another cog in the machine. Take the road of Pip, not the one of Louis, because Pip found his happy medium. Louis, I believe, did not. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you want to see more content like this in the future, please do let me know. Make sure to like, subscribe, or tell me why you didn't like the video and give it a thumbs down. Tell me what I can improve on. Thank you once again, and I will see you all in the next video.